So next up we have Benson from UCL, and he's going to talk to us about his fast pattern detection in kinetic Monte Carlo simulations.
Right. Let's check it's working. Yeah. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to present my work here. My name is Raz. I'm, as said, talking about fast pattern detection in kinetic Monte Carlo simulations of heterogeneous catalysis. And I think there are people with a range of scientific backgrounds here, so I'm going to start with an overview of heterogeneous catalysis. The idea here is that many chemical reactions can be sped up or in some other way controlled by the presence of a solid surface. Usually this is the surface of a metal, which we refer to as the catalyst, and in principle it's recyclable because it doesn't get used up during the reaction. Heterogeneous catalysis is of great importance in the chemical industry. It's safe to say it underpins most industrially relevant chemical reactions. The mechanism can be rather involved. This schematic at the bottom illustrates just one of the simplest such mechanisms. We can start with two molecules in the gas phase, orange and blue. They in turn will diffuse towards the surface. They adsorb on the surface, stick to the surface, and then they may also diffuse around the surface of the catalyst. And having them adsorb next to each other makes it more likely that they will react with one another and then subsequently desorb back into the gas phase. Now, in practice, the mechanisms of catalysis tend to be quite a lot more complex than the one just illustrated. And so for that reason, kinetic modeling plays a really important role. The kind of insight we can get from kinetic modeling can hopefully move us away from the traditional approach to identifying new catalysts by trial and error towards a scenario of what we call rational catalyst design, which is where we could ideally engineer new materials for catalysis based on their predicted properties. Now, there are lots of different approaches we could use to kinetic modeling. The one that's most appropriate for our purposes is what we call kinetic Monte Carlo, or KMC. This is a stochastic simulation method where elementary events such as chemical reactions and adsorption events are treated as discrete Poisson processes with pre-parameterized rate constants. What this means is that the time that we'd have to wait for any particular event to take place in the simulation can be treated as a continuous random variable which follows an exponential distribution depending on the rate constant. In a sense, what we have here is a kind of temporal coarse graining because we're effectively averaging over all the fast dynamical processes like molecular vibrations and rotations and focusing just on the interesting chemical processes like reactions and surface diffusion, etc. So that means we can treat quite long timescales which are relevant to heterogeneous catalysis. In our group, we develop a software package for performing KMC simulations with quite a high degree of generality. This software package is called Zecross, and it adopts a graph theoretical formalism. Now, the foundation of this formalism is a graph which I'm calling capital G, and this represents the lattice. It comprises a set of vertices which represent the lattice sites onto which molecules and atoms might be adsorbed. We have a set of edges connecting the lattice sites, which represent neighboring relationships. And finally, we have a set of vertex labels, which tell us the other relevant chemical information, like the site type and coverage. And this will change as the simulation progresses. Now, to make this formalism useful, we have to go a step further and realize that elementary events, like chemical reactions, can also be represented as graphs. So I'm calling this kind of graph lowercase g to differentiate it from the lattice graph. It has a similar nature to the lattice graph, but it comes with two sets of vertex labels, one which represents the lattice coverage before the reaction takes place, one for after the reaction. Now, at any point in the simulation, for a particular elementary event to be feasible, we need to be able to map the sites of the event graph to the sites of the lattice. So what that means, if we restate that formula, we can say that the event graph G, little g, needs to be isomorphic to a subgraph of the lattice graph big G. That means we have some mapping that takes us from the vertices of the event graph to the vertices of the lattice graph, which preserves both the connectivity, which is symbolized by the edges, and the site types and coverage, which is symbolized by the vertex labels. So the task of detecting feasible elementary reactions and other events amounts to solving what we call a subgraph isomorphism problem. Now we can, which means basically finding all such mappings that exist from the event graph to the lattice graph. We can go a step further than that even. Those of you with knowledge of chemistry will know that rate constants usually depend on activation energies, and these activation energies in the context of surface reactions will depend in turn on the lattice coverage. Now, actually computing the contribution of the lattice coverage to the activation energy in general is a very difficult task, which I'm not going to discuss in lots of detail. But what's important is that we can parameterize this energy contribution in terms of what we call lateral interaction patterns or clusters. So in other words, we can expand this energy contribution in terms of attractive or repulsive interactions, one body, two body, three body, and so on. Now, elegantly, these lateral interaction patterns can be represented also as graphs, just like the elementary events. So the process of calculating this energy contribution, which involves just basically counting the number of instances of each such pattern, reduces to another subgraph isomorphism problem. Now this turns out usually to be the bottleneck of our KMC simulations, which can be rather expensive. And this is because we're having to repeat this process of identifying these lateral interaction patterns at every step of the simulation for every new feasible elementary event. Every time the coverage changes, the activation energy will be affected. So we're having to repeat these rate constant updates many, many times and solving lots of subgraph isomorphism problems. So for that reason, we are quite keen to improve the efficiency of this part of the simulation. So to restate the problem in general terms, what we're trying to do is find the unique mapping, which I'm calling M, from some graph lowercase g, which is called the query graph, which in our case represents either an elementary event or an energetic interaction pattern. And we're finding the mapping to a subgraph of the data graph, big G, which in our case represents a lattice. Now, for this simple example on the right, we can see kind of straight away there's one isomorphism that exists in this case. So we can map vertex A of the query graph to vertex 1 of the data graph and B to 2. Nothing else is going to be acceptable. This search tree at the top kind of represents the most naive brute force approach to that we could take to identifying that isomorphism. So what we're basically doing is looping over all the query graph vertices and trying to map them in turn with each of the data graph vertices. And then when we get to the end of each branch, we say, is it acceptable? And only 1 out of 9 cases works. So the most, for our purposes, the best way to traverse this tree would be by what's called a depth first search, because the data graphs can be quite large. So that just means that we explore to the end of each branch of the tree before backtracking and moving on to the next data vertex, which avoids having to use too much memory. Now, in practice, we would never actually use this brute force approach because the size of this search tree would grow exponentially with the size of the graphs, so it wouldn't be particularly practical. We can make a number of refinements, however. One thing we can do is we can discard infeasible partial mappings. So, for instance, we can see immediately that if we try to map the vertex A with vertex 2, that won't work because they have different labels. So there's no need to explore this branch of the tree any further. We can prune that at this point. We also don't need to try and match query vertices with data vertices that have already been matched. So, for instance, if we successfully matched A with 1, then we don't need to try and match B with 1 as well, because that wouldn't be a unique mapping. So we don't need to explore that branch all the way to the end. So when we follow this logic all the way through, we get this significantly simpler looking search tree. that's going to be much more efficient to loop over. And this represents how the pattern detection problem is currently implemented in the current release of our software. And usually this works reasonably well. However, we've found that we can do quite a lot better than this. The subgraph isomorphism problem is very well studied in the literature for lots of different cases. And we have identified two particular algorithms from the literature that are well suited to our purposes, called the VF2 algorithm and the RI algorithm. Now, the first thing that both of these do to simplify the search is that they use a clever ordering strategy for looping over the query vertices. So for choosing which is the next query vertex we're going to try and match. Now, they both do this in slightly different ways, both in some sense trying to quantify the connectivity of the query vertices to those which have already been matched. So for this example, you can see they give, if this is our query graph, that they give similar but slightly different orderings of the query vertices. The other thing that these algorithms do is they use some quite stringent rules to reduce the search space for each query vertex. So to limit how many data vertices we're trying to match them with based on their properties. So for instance, in VF2, if we imagine that we've got this query graph in black and we've already successfully matched two of its vertices to this data graph in grey, and now we want to know which of the remaining data vertices we should try to match the last one with. VF2 will tell us to attempt all of the neighbours of those which have already been matched. RI is somewhat stricter, will only tell us to attempt this one. Both of these are somewhat stricter than the simpler depth-first search algorithms which I showed on the previous slide. Now, we have implemented all these algorithms in our KMC software package. So now, in addition to the core pattern detection routines, which, as I said, are based on what I've called just the basic refined depth-first search strategy, I'm calling this the legacy implementation. We've also written a separate pattern detection class. This is based on the brute force depth-first search, which would never be used in practice, but inherited from that all the other more refined algorithms, including a re-implementation of the basic refined depth-first search. Now, to assess the performance of these different implementations, we've simulated nitric oxide oxidation on platinum. And we've compared a number of different energetic models with increasing sizes of cluster expansions, so meaning increasing complexity of the energetic patterns that we're trying to detect. So in the simplest case, we have just three figures, so three different patterns we're trying to detect, just incorporating one body terms and nearest neighbor pairwise interactions. And then in the most complex case involving 12 different figures, we have much longer range two-body interactions and also some three-body interactions. So that's kind of a more stringent test for our algorithms. Now, how does our code perform? So what I'm plotting here is what I'm calling the KMC acceleration factor. So this just tells us the speed of the KMC simulation relative to that when we use the legacy code. So you'll see all the X's, which represent the legacy pattern detection code, have a value of 1. And the impressive result is that when we use our most advanced subgraph isomorphism algorithms, RI and VF2, we get almost 20 times acceleration relative to the legacy code. If in the case of the most complex lateral energetic interactions. We still get a modest improvement when we have the kind of middle-sized energetic models. In the simplest case, with just three figures, we don't get that much change, and in fact, we're slightly better off using our legacy code. and that's fine. And we would like to understand a bit better why we get this different behavior for the different energetic models. So on this next slide, what I'm plotting is a measure of the success of partial matches during for each algorithm. So this is defined as the fraction of partial matches that are attempted which are deemed to have the right connectivity. So when this takes a value of 1, we've done the very best we can at reducing the size of the search tree. So every single kind of mapping we attempt kind of returns true, effectively. So what we find is that, impressively, the RI algorithm, which has the strictest search-based reduction rules, is effectively perfect for everything except the most complex energetic model. So it always returns. So every partial match attempted has the correct connectivity, which explains why it's usually the fastest one. On the other hand, when we look at the simplest energetic model with just 3 figures, all the algorithms are equally effective. All of them are basically doing as well as we can possibly do at reducing the search space. So in this case, there's no need to use the more advanced algorithms which come with additional computational overhead, and we might as well just use the basic depth-first search. The last thing I'm going to show you is that we've in addition to implementing these different algorithms, we've been successful in parallelizing this part of the code that does the rate constant update, which is the bit that involves detecting energetic patterns. In line with intuition, we find that the larger the cluster expansion, so the more patterns we're trying to detect at once, the more beneficial it is to use as parallelization. So if we're only trying to detect these 3 figures, we don't get much more than we don't accelerate more than about twice using these even if we go up to 16 OpenMP threads. On the other hand, with a 12-figure expansion, if we get quite significant speed ups. So then if we combine the best pattern detection algorithm, which is RI, with parallelization over 16 threads, we can get overall up to about 120 times acceleration relative to the legacy code. So to summarize, I've introduced Kinetic Monte Carlo, which is a stochastic simulation method in which we treat elementary processes as discrete events. And while this is very powerful for modeling heterogeneous catalysis, it can be computationally expensive, which is particularly true when we have lots of fast surface diffusion. The bottleneck is usually the computation of lateral energetic interactions, which I've shown in the graph theoretical formalism involves solving lots of subgraph isomorphism problems. So we implemented a family of depth-first search algorithms in our software package Zecross, and combining that with OpenMP parallelization, the most advanced algorithms, RI and VF2, can give us almost 120 times acceleration. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Russ. Any questions?
Liberty. I just wanted to see if I've missed some information. It's on the parallelization slide, was it? Yeah. So when you say we see 120 times speed up with 16 threads, on what kind of hardware? So what would that be running on?
Just like a CPU, like just one node. I don't know what. Yeah, I'm not sure on all the details.
I'm just trying to get a feel for how many cores. Sort of
right.
Because obviously, if you break the work down into the threads, that's one thing. But if you're running it on,
no, I think it's 16 cores. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting to see that level of speed up by breaking a process down into a huge number of threads.
Just to clarify, so it's 120 times is versus the legacy code run serially, right? So it was not that much compared to like the same code run serially doesn't give that much.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm not an expert, but from the atomistic point of view, simulation point of view, is there any way that, you know, the most computing costly part, that you look at the various ways that they interact with each other, is there a way to compute it at the atomistic level, you know, in terms of the chemical models, and feed that information in terms of kind of a multi-scale level of model for this approach?
Right. So the way this is done is that the where was it? Yeah. So this cluster expansion is fitted to ab initio data, so to DFT data. And I mean, in principle, there's any different number of ways you could obtain that. You could do the ab initio calculations, but this is just a kind of, the idea is to not have to do any of that on the fly. So that's the input to the simulation. So the rate constant are pre-parameterized. So then this, although, I said that it's slow, but a lot faster than it would be to do all of that. So does that answer your question, or yeah?
Any more? All the way at the back.
At least you exercise a bit. Very nice presentation. A follow-up on what Stephen was asking. You just only parallelize using OpenMP. Mm-hmm. Any sort of plan to try this over MPI or GPU acceleration?
GPU, I don't have a good answer to, but MPI, if you go to my colleague Electra's talk tomorrow, she's talking about MPI parallelization, which is done a very different way. So that's based on domain decomposition of the lattice. I don't know about MPI parallelization of the pattern detection, like specifically. I don't think it would necessarily be worth it, but as a tool in general for kinetic Monte Carlo, yeah, it's been done fairly recently. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more? Nope. I guess we'll move on then. We're slightly ahead of schedule, so we'll be able to get into lunch early. Thanks. So we just thank Raz again. Oh.